Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong simply because of how you looked? What if you were calm, quiet, and powerful, and still they asked you to step aside? Imagine this: a composed black man in an expensive gray suit, standing at an airport gate. His name, Elias Monroe. His crime, boarding the flight he paid for. They didn't know he owned one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. They didn't know their whispered comments and random policy would ignite a national reckoning. But what happened on that plane wasn't just about one man. It was about every person who's ever been told to wait, to hush, to disappear. And what Elias did next, it didn't just change one flight, it grounded an entire system. Why didn't he speak up right away? What happened to the teen girl who stood up beside him, and what exactly did he do that made the world stop and listen? Stick with us. This story will make you angry, proud, and maybe even cry. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's dive into a story that took off in silence but landed with thunder. The plane hummed with a low, steady vibration as it cruised at 36,000 feet above the ground. In first class, the air was chilled, stale with recycled calm. A gentle chime echoed overhead, followed by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently flying over the Rockies. Estimated time to land in New York, 2 hours and 17 minutes. But no one was paying attention to the captain's voice now. Every head had turned toward seat 1A. A flight attendant stood frozen mid-step, her hand still clenching the edge of the tray cart. The tablet in her other hand trembled slightly. She had just finished reading aloud the breaking headline that had appeared on every passenger's Wi-Fi-enabled screen. SkyTide Tech terminates 340-mile contract with Horizon Fly, effective immediately. Gasps. A man in 2D whispered, "Wait, that's this airline." And then the whisper turned to questions, confusion, murmurs, panic. A few people even started filming. But Elias Monroe, sitting in seat 1A, didn't say a word. His eyes remained fixed on the untouched glass of still water in front of him. No ice, no lemon, just water. His hands, resting loosely in his lap, remained perfectly still. The only giveaway barely visible was the slow tightening of his jaw. The woman beside him, her name was Marina Price, the head of legal for Horizon Fly, though she'd refused to introduce herself earlier, finally broke the silence. "Mr. Monroe, this must be some kind of error." Her voice was tight, almost panicked now. Elias turned slowly. "No, Ms. Price," he said, his voice low, smooth, precise. "It's not." There was no anger in his tone, no raised voice, and yet the quiet weight of those 3 words seemed to thunder louder than the jet engines outside. She blinked. But this decision on a plane. "Why now?" he smiled faintly. A smile not of satisfaction, but of resolve. "Because I wanted the message to reach them," he said, nodding toward the rest of the passengers at 36,000 feet. Just like the damage their decisions caused above everything else. He picked up his phone, calmly opened his notes app, and checked something off a list. Marina leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a hiss. "Do you realize the scope of what you've done?" The bored Elias met her eyes. The board knew. "I briefed them an hour ago." The announcement was timed. He turned back toward the window, watching sunlight fracture over the cloud line. The skies are supposed to be neutral. Ms. Price. But lately, even the sky has forgotten how to be fair. She said nothing, because how could she, less than 20 minutes earlier? Elias had boarded this very flight without a word. He'd nodded politely at the flight crew, even when they delayed him unnecessarily, checking his boarding pass twice while letting others waltz by with a smile. He'd been the last to enter the first-class cabin despite holding priority status. He'd heard them snicker softly behind him. "Must be a tech assistant," one had whispered. He didn't respond. He never did. Let them underestimate. Let them misread. He didn't need them to know who he was, because in 2 hours they all would. 2 days ago. Elias had been denied boarding altogether at another Horizon Fly gate in Chicago, despite holding a confirmed seat and being the keynote speaker at the conference the airline was sponsoring. A junior gate agent had called for verification. When he calmly asked if this was standard procedure for first-class customers, she had shrugged. "Just following what my manager told me," she'd said. So Elias had waited. He'd missed the flight, and the world had kept turning. But something inside him hadn't. Now, seated on the same airline's plane flying back to his own headquarters in Manhattan, he had made a decision. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for dignity, for accountability. He didn't rage, he didn't rant. He acted. Because that's what power is. It's not loud. It doesn't beg for validation. It simply moves, and everything around it shifts. In the back of the cabin, a young black flight attendant, no more than 25, paused mid-service. She'd seen the alert. She'd seen Elias 2 days earlier when he was turned away at the gate. Their eyes met for the briefest second. She gave him the smallest nod, a silent thank you. Elias closed his eyes briefly, not in pride, but in release. He wasn't angry at Horizon Fly. He was disappointed. Disappointed that in a world building rockets to Mars and AI to cure diseases, something as basic as respect still needed to be taught, not understood. Disappointed that a company could print slogans about diversity while quietly scripting bias into every corner of its system. Disappointed that silence had become a substitute for professionalism, he opened his phone again. Typed one final line. Change doesn't begin with noise. It begins with someone refusing to accept silence. Then he put the phone down and looked out the window again. Somewhere beneath the clouds, a storm was brewing. But up here, the skies were finally, perfectly clear. The office lights stayed on long past sunset. From the 47th floor of SkyTide Tech's Manhattan headquarters, the city below looked like a circuit board lit, humming, and relentless. But in Elias Monroe's office, the glow came not from neon, but from the soft warmth of wood panels, a shelf lined with old books, and the quiet presence of memory. The silence was not empty. It was loaded with questions. Elias leaned back in his chair, hands laced over his chest, eyes tracing the skyline beyond the window. A knock. Then the door opened. "You've been in here 3 hours," said Raina Chen, his chief operating officer. "You're doing the stare thing again." He offered a slight smile. "I didn't know it had a name." "It does. It's the look you get when something's burning inside you, but you won't let it out." She didn't sit. She just stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of her slate-colored blazer, waiting. He finally spoke. "It's not about what happened at the gate," Elias said softly. "Not really." Raina tilted her head. "Then what is it?" "It's about how normal it felt. How easy it was for them to look at me and assume I didn't belong." He paused. "Even when I showed my ticket, even when I said, calmly, who I was, there was no fear of consequence, no shame, just protocol and quiet power. Raina walked to the window, letting the city reflect in her glasses. "So, what are you going to do? I don't want to destroy them," Elias said. But I can't do nothing." He had tried nothing before. As a rising executive, he had laughed off comments like, "You don't look like a tech guy," or, "Wow, you're the real CEO." He'd smiled through interviews where journalists spent more time on his inspiring journey than the breakthroughs his company had made. He'd been gracious, composed, strategic, but the gate agent last week hadn't cared who he was, because to her, in that moment, he was simply not the image of someone who could sit in 1A, and that image was defended, backed by an entire structure, written in job protocols, soaked in bias, protected by silence. Elias felt the heat behind his sternum again, not rage, not ego, grief. The quiet grief of realizing that respect was still conditional. Raina broke the silence. "You built SkyTide to disrupt broken systems. Maybe it's time we treated partnerships the same way." He looked up. She placed a folder on his desk. Inside, the Horizon Fly Strategic Agreement, scheduled to renew in 60 days. The $340 million deal provided secure cloud infrastructure for their entire global operations. It also included a discretionary termination clause if SkyTide found ethical misalignment. That clause had never been used. Elias stared at it now like it had just come to life. "If we walk," he said slowly, "it'll create a storm. A storm clears the air." She replied. Later that night, Elias stood in his kitchen, pouring tea into a thick white mug. The light was low. His daughter Ayanna padded in quietly in her socks. "Couldn't sleep," she said, curling into the corner of the couch. "Too many tests tomorrow." He brought her tea, sat across from her. "You ever feel like people don't expect you to do well just because you look like you do?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "Why would you say that, Mr. Garrett at school, he called me articulate after my presentation? Like it was a surprise." Elias set the mug down a little too quickly. Ayanna shrugged. "It's not a big deal," she said, but it was, because the small things add up. The next morning, Elias met with his legal counsel, comms director, and diversity officer, not to wage war, but to lay out a plan for principled action. He wanted the withdrawal from Horizon Fly to be transparent, measured, and backed by data. Lena Howlbrook, the young flight attendant who'd witnessed the gate incident, submitted a written statement, anonymously. Others followed. Current and former Horizon Fly employees quietly reached out, sharing stories, policies, screenshots of chats. A systemic pattern emerged. Certain passengers flagged for secondary verification based on subjective behavioral notes, with disproportionate representation of black and brown travelers. One internal message chilled Elias to his core. "We like to keep the front of the plane looking a certain way. It reassures our usual clientele." The message was 3 years old. It had never been deleted. That evening, Elias finalized his decision. The termination letter would go live mid-flight. He would board the same airline. He would sit silently. He would let the system reveal itself again on its own terms. Only this time, he wouldn't walk away quietly. He would walk away with purpose. Before bed, he sent a text to Raina. "I want this to be more than a statement. I want it to spark a new standard." She replied simply, "Then let's make it loud, even in silence." And so, the boarding pass was scanned, the seat was assigned, and the countdown began. Not to take off, but to reckoning. The automatic doors slid open with a hush of compressed air. The airport terminal smelled of coffee, tension, and too many people rushing toward somewhere. Elias Monroe walked slowly, not because he was late, but because he needed the silence before the storm. In his hand a single carry-on, matte black, on his wrist a watch given to him by his late father, its face worn from decades of use, and in his mind a decision already made. The announcement echoed overhead. Now, boarding Group 1, passengers in first class, elite status, and military. Please proceed to Gate 19. He stepped into line. There were 7 others ahead of him, all white, mostly men, one wearing golf cleats. The gate agent, a woman in her early 30s with sleek blonde hair and a name tag that read Nolra, scanned their tickets briskly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Delaney." "Thanks," the man muttered, barely slowing his pace. Elias stepped forward. She looked at him, paused, then she smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll need to check your ID again, sir," she said. "You didn't check the last passengers." Elias replied calmly. "It's just protocol," she said, this time with a hint of defensiveness. He offered her his ID without hesitation. Of course. She took longer than necessary. Checked the ID, the boarding pass, back to the ID, then to his face. A full 17 seconds passed. "All set," she finally said, and waved him through. He didn't say anything, but as he walked past, he heard her mutter, "Unbelievable." On board. The first-class cabin had that muted luxury cream leather seats, navy carpeting, silver nameplates above the windows. Elias found 1A and quietly placed his bag in the overhead bin. He didn't need help. A middle-aged flight attendant approached, a clipboard in her hand. Tyrek Vane, the lead attendant, followed closely behind. "May I help you with your bag, sir?" she asked. Almost automatically, "No, thank you," he replied. She hesitated. "Do you have the right seat?" "Yes. 1A, Elias Monroe." The name made Tyrek glance at his manifest. Something flickered behind his eyes, confusion, perhaps recognition, but he said nothing. "Very well," he said stiffly. They walked off without offering a welcome drink, or even a polite smile. The man in 1B, a hedge fund manager by the look of him, leaned over. "They always double-check you too?" he asked, a smug grin playing on his lips. "No," Elias said, settling into his seat. "Just today." As more passengers boarded, Elias closed his eyes and began to count his breaths. 1, 2, 3. It wasn't nerves. It was preparation. He wasn't the kind of man to let emotion spill at the wrong time. But inside, the pressure was rising. Not from rage, but from restraint. He remembered his daughter's voice from the night before. "Why do people always want me to explain myself when I've done nothing wrong?" He hadn't had an answer then, and that was the part that stung the most. 25 minutes passed. Everyone had boarded. The pilot's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Horizon Fly Flight 721 nonstop service to New York." Elias tuned it out. Instead, he watched the people, the way the flight attendants gave warm smiles to certain passengers and robotic nods to others, how they skipped his row altogether with the drink cart the first time around. It wasn't personal. It was worse, it was systemic. It was rehearsed, subtle enough to deny, clear enough to feel. Lena Hallbrook, the youngest flight attendant on board, finally approached him. Her steps were slower, more deliberate. "Mr. Monroe," she said gently. He looked up. She handed him a glass of water. No questions, no assumptions. "We met once at O'Hare," she said in a whisper. "Last week." He nodded. "Thank you. They shouldn't have done that," she added, barely audible. "I just wanted you to know. Some of us see it." Their eyes met for a moment, a silent, quiet bond forged not in protest, but in understanding. She walked away without another word, and that meant more than 100 apologies. The plane began to taxi. The cabin dimmed. Elias unlocked his phone. One email sat in drafts. Subject notice of strategic termination. To Marina Price, legal counsel, Horizon Fly attached legal review, supporting documentation, contract clause citations, witness reports, internal communications, and a formal ethics audit. He hovered over the send button. He didn't doubt the decision, but he did feel the weight. There would be backlash, headlines, accusations of overreaction. They'd say he was playing the race card. They'd call him emotional, and yet none of them had ever sat in 1A and been made to feel like they'd broken in. He closed his eyes. One more breath. Then he tapped send. The plane lifted from the tarmac a moment later. Outside, the world dropped away, but inside, something had finally taken flight. At 35,000 feet, silence has a shape. It curves through the cabin like a shadow, quiet, smooth, almost invisible. But for people like Elias Monroe, it always leaves a trace, not in the air, but in the way people look without looking, the way glances are measured, the way respect is delayed, conditional, filtered. He had seen this pattern before, but never quite like this. The drink cart returned, this time led by Tyrek Vane himself. He offered options to the man in 1B with the ease of old habit: club, soda, sparkling water, gin, and tonic. Then Tyrek turned to Elias. No smile, no list, just water. Elias looked up, eyes calm. "I'd like the same list you just gave him." Tyrek blinked. "Sir, I'd like to hear all my options." There was a pause, a slight shift in the air. The hedge fund manager in 1B cleared his throat awkwardly. "Gin and tonic, sparkling, club soda," Tyrek mumbled, suddenly flustered. "Sparkling water is fine," Elias said, voice even, but it wasn't about the drink. It never was. Later, a small turbulence bump shook the cabin. The seatbelt light flickered on. People shifted, muttered. Tyrek came back around. He stopped in front of Elias again. "Sir, are you all right?" The tone wasn't concern. It was scrutiny. Like he was checking for something, anything that could be flagged. A reason to label Elias as difficult, aggressive, unstable. Elias gave a gentle nod. "Perfectly fine. Thank you." Tyrek moved on, but Lena Hallbrook, seated 2 rows behind in the jump seat, noticed the interaction. Her brow furrowed. She'd seen it before, too, just never at the front of the plane. The cabin dimmed again for the meal service. Elias wasn't hungry. He unfolded his tablet instead, swiping through internal SkyTide documents, supply chain restructuring, ESG metrics, and the early design specs for Project Tundra, a secure communication platform for disaster relief zones. It was his life's work. Years of fighting for a seat at tables he wasn't invited to. Now, the irony, he had built one of the most powerful digital infrastructures on Earth, and yet, on this flight, he was still being treated like a maybe. He looked around the cabin. The woman across the aisle wore diamond earrings and a cream blazer, typing rapidly on her MacBook. The older couple in 2A and 2B quietly watched a documentary. No one was doing anything wrong, but that was the problem. No one had to. The unspoken rules did the heavy lifting. Rules like, Speak softly, but only if you look the part. Be excellent, but never too assertive. Be patient with disrespect, it might be accidental. Rules that Elias had followed his whole life. Rules he was no longer willing to play by. Halfway through the flight, Lena made her way down the aisle. She paused again by Elias's seat, crouching slightly so others wouldn't notice. "They're watching you," she whispered, "not because of who you are, but because they still don't believe you are who you say you are." Elias gave her a tired half-smile. "That's nothing new." "Still," she said softly, "I think they're trying to find something they can report. Just be careful." He nodded once. "Thank you." She didn't linger, didn't want to draw attention, but her warning sat heavy in his chest. Back in the galley, Lena overheard Tyrek speaking in low tones to Nolra Keene, the gate agent who had boarded with the crew. "He's got an attitude," Tyrek said. "You saw the way he challenged me over a drink order." "Just keep an eye on him," Nolra murmured. "We still have hours left. If he steps out of line, we flag him." Tyrek finished. "Document it, file it, cover ourselves." Neither of them knew Lena was listening from behind the curtain. Her heart dropped. So this wasn't about a misunderstanding. It was a setup, and Elias didn't even know it yet. Back in his seat, Elias finally turned his phone off airplane mode, not for signal, but for silence. The news alert was already there. SkyTide CEO pulls plug on $340 million airline contract mid-flight. Underneath, speculation swirled. Had he acted out of ego? Had he been offended by a minor slight? One tweet read, "Classic overreaction. Just take the seat and fly. Why do people always have to make everything racial?" He didn't engage, but the sting was real. Even before they landed, the public verdict was being shaped. He looked at the window clouds blurring into streaks. There was a time he would have worried about being too much, too visible, too vocal. But that time had passed, because if the cost of success was invisibility, then what was the point? He pulled out his notebook and began to write. Not notes, not strategy, just thoughts. "I'm tired of apologizing for being fully present in a world that prefers me silent. I'm not angry. I'm awake." The seatbelt light dinged off again. Flight 721 had settled into the long stretch of its eastward journey. A steady hum filled the cabin of engines, of muffled conversation, of the clink of glasses behind the curtain. Elias Monroe reclined slightly, fingers resting on his chest. Not asleep, not awake, just drifting in that weightless space between presence and retreat. Until he heard the voice. Not loud, but sharp and frightened. "Please don't touch me. It came from the back. Coach." But something in the tone cut through layers of dull air and artificial calm. Elias opened his eyes. He didn't move yet, but he was listening. In the rear galley, Lena Hallbrook had just reached the back when she saw it. A young black teen girl, maybe 16, was standing, her back pressed against the bulkhead, cornered. A man in his mid-50s, flushed, wearing a faded baseball cap and a hunting jacket, was yelling in her face. "Don't lie to me, girl. I saw you looking in my bag." She shook her head rapidly. "I didn't touch anything. I was just trying to get past." Tyrek Vane was already there, arms crossed. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice devoid of urgency. "This kid tried to steal from me," the man barked. "That's not true," the girl cried. "I was just going to the bathroom, and he grabbed me." Lena stepped in. "I saw it," she said quickly. "She didn't do anything." Tyrek shot her a warning glance. Let's let security sort this out when we land. But we can't just let him accuse her, Lena insisted. He laid hands on her. The man smirked. Figures you'd defend her. The two of you probably know each other. Meanwhile, the tension had begun to ripple forward. Whispers passed row to row. Elias unbuckled his seatbelt. He rose not abruptly, but with purpose. The hedge fund manager in 1B raised an eyebrow. "You don't want to get involved. I already am," Elias said, moving down the aisle. By the time he reached the rear cabin, the girl was crying. Tyrek stood stiffly between her and the man, trying to look neutral. Lena was visibly shaken half from anger, half from helplessness, and passengers were watching, recording, murmuring. "Is there a problem here?" Elias asked calmly, addressing the group, not just the crew. Tyrek turned, lips tightening. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please return to your seat. It concerns me when a child is being accused without evidence," Elias said. His voice didn't rise, but it carried. "I'm the CEO of SkyTide. I know what manufactured escalation looks like." The man in the cap scoffed. "Of course, another rich suit defending criminals. Shocker." Elias stepped forward, not threatening, but firm. "Are you accusing this girl of theft?" "I said what I said," the man muttered, shrinking slightly. "Do you have proof she was looking in my overhead bin?" "Looking is not stealing," Elias replied, "and she has witnesses." He turned slightly to the other passengers. "Anyone else see what happened?" A woman from 17C raised her hand. He grabbed her arm. "She wasn't doing anything," Lena added. He lunged at her. "That's when I intervened." Tyrek's face flushed red. He turned to Nolra, who had come from the forward galley. "We'll document this," he muttered, "and notify ground security." For the girl, Elias asked. For everyone involved. Tyrek snapped, including the man who grabbed her. There was silence. Then Nolra said quietly, "That's a standard procedure." Elias shook his head slowly. "No, that's cowardice dressed up as protocol." The girl, whose name they later learned was Sariah Jameson, finally spoke. "Why is it always like this?" She whispered. "I didn't do anything." Elias looked at her. "I know." And that made her cry again. Not because it hurt, but because she finally felt seen. Back in first class, as Elias returned to his seat, the cabin was quiet. People had heard, watched, felt the weight shift. The hedge fund guy didn't say anything this time, but his eyes followed Elias with something close to respect, or maybe guilt. 30 minutes later, Lena came forward again. She handed Elias a folded note. From her, she whispered, inside, written in uneven script, "Thank you for not looking away." Sariah Elias closed the note gently, then opened his tablet again. He added a single bullet point to the next SkyTide initiative, Bias Intervention Training for Public-Facing Teams. Under it, a sub-point, partner with airlines, train frontline staff, but before he closed the file, he added something else. Disruption isn't always noise. Sometimes it's presence. The cabin lights flickered once. Some passengers thought little of it, just turbulence. But for Elias Monroe, it was a signal, a shift. Moments after defending Sariah Jameson, he knew what was coming. Not from the man who'd falsely accused the girl. No, this would come from the system itself. The one that smiled politely as it tightened its grip. Back in the galley, Tyrek Vane and Nolra Keene stood close together. Not whispering, but close enough that others wouldn't hear. He's undermining our authority, Tyrek said flatly, and now other passengers are getting involved. He's the CEO of a major tech company. Nolra replied, SkyTide's stock jumped 6 points when he got on this flight. I don't care if he built the internet. Tyrek snapped. He's creating a hostile environment. Nolra hesitated. Should we notify the captain? Already did. 20 minutes later, the intercom chimed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morell Thorne. We've been made aware of a situation involving a disturbance in the cabin. We're currently coordinating with authorities on the ground. We ask for your continued cooperation. The words were vague, deliberately so, but their weight was specific. Elias could feel eyes on him, from rows behind, from across the aisle. The hedge fund manager in 1B leaned in slightly. They're talking about you, aren't they? Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lena Halbrook approached quietly. Her voice was a whisper behind her composed smile. Captain, just radioed ahead. They're planning to have airport police meet the flight, for whom Elias asked, you and Sariah, a pause. Not the man who grabbed her, he asked. Lena shook her head. He's already being described as a concerned passenger. Elias let out a quiet breath. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. They're building a narrative. Yes, she said, her voice tight, and if you resist, they'll call it aggression. He nodded. I won't give them that. But inside, the storm had started. Elias sat back in his seat and pulled out his phone again. No signal, but he opened a private draft anyway, a message to his chief legal officer, typed slowly, begin reviewing Horizon Fly contract terms. Pay special attention to behavioral clause language. We may be forced to respond mid-flight. Stand by. He hit save, but not send, not yet. In the back, Sariah sat alone. Tears dried on her face. She didn't have anyone up there in first class watching out for her now. No one holding the line. Until a flight attendant, not Lena, brought her a warm blanket and whispered, "Stay in your seat. Don't speak to anyone else. Not even the crew." Sariah blinked. Why? The attendant glanced around nervously. Because they've marked you. For what? For being inconvenient. Back in the forward galley, Tyrek was smiling. Practicing it, really. A preemptive calm. The kind of smile that says, we did what we had to. Nolra checked her tablet. A message from the captain flashed ground security on standby. Prepare written statements. Emphasize emotional disruption. Tyrek added a note. Passenger Elias Monroe displayed increasingly hostile posture. Created environment of uncertainty for staff. Refused multiple requests. It was all lies, but well-dressed ones. Elias walked to the lavatory. As he stood in front of the mirror, he studied his own eyes. The calm was still there, but it was a tired calm, not from fear, from knowing how fast reputations can be rewritten by the frightened hands of bureaucracy. He returned to his seat, pulled out a blank page, and started writing a speech, a defense. No, just a truth. We've been told to wait, to not disrupt, to be grateful for partial respect. But there comes a time when silence serves no one, and dignity begins with defiance, not volume, but presence. The pen stopped. His hand trembled slightly. Not from nerves, from restraint. The captain came out briefly. Captain Myril Thorne, a tall, white man with silver at his temples and a practiced neutrality in his posture. He looked at Elias. Sir, we understand there was a situation earlier. There was. We're following up. with the man who grabbed the girl. We're reviewing all angles, including the crew's treatment of your only black passenger in first class." The captain's eyes flicked just for a second. "We'll have to let the authorities sort that out." Elias nodded. "Of course you will. Later." Lena returned with a glass of water. She didn't say anything, just left it on his tray. Their eyes met, and that was enough. A silent agreement. If this was the hill, it was one worth standing on. Somewhere over Illinois. The cabin lights dimmed again. Outside, the sky was soft with dusk, stitched in quiet purples and blues. Inside, however, the air was tense, not loud, but dense, like a storm about to press through the seams. Elias Monroe stared straight ahead. He hadn't moved much in the last 30 minutes. Still, but thinking. The kind of stillness that happens right before a decision becomes action. A new sound stirred the cabin, the rustle of passenger notices. Flight attendants were beginning to discreetly pass out forms incident statements, a clipboard for those who had seen what happened in coach. One came to Elias, held out by Tyrick Vane with the cold professionalism of a man confident in his story. "Please describe your role in the cabin disruption, sir." Elias looked at the clipboard, then looked up. "Roll," he repeated. "Is that what this is now?" "Just procedure." "No," Elias said calmly. "This is containment." Tyrick's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. The paper spoke for him. It always had. Elias took the clipboard and began writing. At the same time, Sariah Jameson was being handed her own form, a different version. It asked if she'd been involved in any threatening behavior, if she'd resisted flight crew directives, if she'd attempted to interfere with flight operations. The questions weren't questions. They were traps, laced with legalese, the kind a frightened teenager could fall into just by trying to explain herself. She didn't answer them. She just sat there, the pen trembling in her hand, until someone slid into the seat beside her. Lena Hallbrook. "Don't sign anything yet," she whispered. "They said I have to know. You don't. Not without someone on your side." "Are you on my side?" "Yes," Lena said, looking over the form. "And now we play it smarter than them." Meanwhile, Elias finished his statement, but instead of turning it in, he photographed it. Then he turned on airplane mode briefly, toggling it off just long enough to let a signal squeak through. It caught, and the image sent to his general counsel, his executive assistant, and someone else, Dawson Lane, the head of corporate partnerships at Horizon Fly. He added one line of text. "This is the beginning of a legal record. Let's see who finishes it." He set the phone down gently. In the forward galley, Tyrick was already rewriting events. Passenger was increasingly disruptive, used position of influence to intimidate crew, refused to comply with directions. Each sentence sounded like it came from a handbook, because it did. He knew how this worked. If he got ahead of the story, he owned the ending. Nora glanced at his notes and hesitated. We should be careful what we claim. Tyrick didn't even look up. This is how we protect the airline, or how we make it worse, Nora said under her breath. Back in first class, Elias stood. For a moment, all eyes followed him. But he didn't raise his voice. He simply walked calmly, deliberately toward the curtain separating first from economy. He paused there, and then stepped through. The coach cabin fell into silence. Elias didn't speak yet. He walked to the row where Sariah sat, still holding her blank form. "Ms. Jameson," he said softly, "you're not alone." She looked up. Her eyes were tired, but they focused. They said the police are meeting us when we land. They are, Elias replied. For me, for us, somewhere behind them. A passenger began recording again, and Elias allowed it. He turned to the camera and spoke not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. If there is anyone here who saw what happened, who knows this young woman was targeted without cause, I ask you to write it down, say it, because the truth isn't what we whisper, it's what we witness. For a beat, no one moved. Then a hand rose, 17C, the same woman from earlier. She didn't do anything. Then another. That man yelled at her. Another. The flight attendant watched and did nothing. Suddenly, silence cracked open, and truth came pouring through. Up front, the flight crew scrambled. Tyrik's face turned pale as the intercom buzzed in. Captain Morrell Thorne had heard everything from the cockpit. "What's going on back there? We may have lost the narrative," Tyrik said. The captain's voice sharpened. "Handle it. Before we land, it may be too late for that." In the last 30 minutes of the flight, the atmosphere changed. Not violently, but unmistakably. Passengers who had once stayed quiet were now watching Elias Monroe like he was gravity drawing them in, pulling something hidden out of them. Not rebellion, recognition of dignity, of restraint, of the quiet fury in a man who had been told, again and again, to wait his turn only to find the line moved every time he stepped forward. Elias sat beside Sariah now. Lena stood nearby. Other passengers whispered, or took notes, or typed messages to family, to friends, to lawyers. The plane was still flying at 38,000 feet, but the ground was already moving beneath them. The cabin lights flickered back to full brightness as the intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thorne. We've begun our initial descent into Denver International. Please ensure your seat backs are upright and your tray tables are stowed." The words rang hollow. Nobody was thinking about tray tables, not after what they'd just witnessed. Not after the way Elias Monroe had walked down that aisle like a quiet revolution in tailored charcoal wool. Flight 394 was no longer just a flight. It was a fault line, and it had cracked straight through every lie trying to hold the story together. Somewhere in row 17, a college student uploaded a video to TikTok. It showed Elias standing beside Sariah Jameson, calmly asking others to speak up. In 2 hours, it would cross 3 million views. But for now, in this narrow tube of sky, everything was still suspended mid-air and mid-judgment in the galley. Tyrik Vane gripped the counter harder than he needed to. "He's weaponizing the cabin," he said aloud to no one. "Or maybe," said Noel Rakeen, quietly repacking the drink tray, "he's just telling the truth louder than you expected." Tyrik turned, sharp. He turned this into a courtroom. "No, you did." Their eyes locked. But Nolra was no longer afraid, not of him, not of what was coming. In first class, Elias finally sat back in his seat. Next to him, Sariah leaned her head against the window. "Is this really happening?" she whispered. Elias turned to her gently. "Yes, and the part they never tell you. What is that? It doesn't get easier. You just get steadier." She nodded, slowly, her jaw set just a little firmer. "I didn't think I'd need to be steady on a plane. They didn't think you'd stand up. And yet, here we are." Behind them, a flight attendant from the rear cabin came forward and quietly slipped something into Elias's hand. A slip of paper, folded 4 times. He opened it, 1 sentence, scribbled in nervous handwriting. I work ground ops for Horizon Fly. We've seen what they do. If you fight this, I'll testify." Elias folded the paper. No smile. Just another fact. Another stone in a foundation quietly being built in real time. Captain Morrell Thorne was growing nervous. The airwaves were already crackling with notification from Denver Ground Control. Security had been alerted. A legal representative from Horizon Fly's PR division was waiting at the gate, and, most concerningly, there was a representative from SkyTide Tech waiting too. Why would the CEO's company care? Thorne muttered. Then he saw the message come through the cockpit printer, SkyTide Chairman, arriving on Flight 394. Deferred ahead of security on landing. Do not engage. Thorne blinked, then read it again. Chairman, not just a wealthy passenger, not just a tech exec. He wasn't some VIP. He was the VIP, and the crew had no idea. "Ladies and gentlemen," the intercom buzzed again. "As we prepare for landing, please remain seated. Security will be greeting the flight due to an onboard incident. We ask for your patience and cooperation." Elias sat still. Didn't flinch, didn't blink. Preparation was no longer hypothetical. This was it. 2 rows back. Lena Hallbrook slipped her phone from airplane mode and began quietly syncing the notes she'd typed throughout the flight. Timelines, witness accounts, even audio snippets she'd captured when Tyrek raised his voice. She wasn't just defending a passenger anymore. She was documenting misconduct. And if Horizon Fly tried to twist the story, she'd make sure they choked on their own edit. Sariah turned slightly to Elias. "Will they arrest me?" "No." "How do you know?" "Because you're not who they said you were, and the whole plane knows it now." She stared ahead, eyes burning, but dry. A teenager who had stepped onto a flight and unknowingly walked into a systemic ambush and chose to stand anyway. "What happens next?" she asked. Elias looked down at his hands, the same ones that had once closed billion-dollar deals and negotiated acquisitions that altered entire industries. Now they were still, but not idle. "Now," he said, "we land, and they find out what happens when you try to shame someone who's done nothing wrong, in front of someone who no longer stays silent." Outside the window, Denver's lights sprawled like a constellation unraveling across the ground. The wheels dropped. The final turn into descent began, and so did the end of their silence. The wheels hit the tarmac with a thunderous, bone-deep thud. Every passenger jolted forward, then sank back as the aircraft slowed. Denver's nighttime runway lights blurred past the windows like fading streaks of fire. But no one spoke. Not really, because everyone knew something was waiting for them at the gate. Elias Monroe didn't check his phone. He didn't stretch. He didn't even unbuckle. He sat perfectly still. Sariah Jameson beside him had gone quiet too, clinging to the small fleece blanket Lena had slipped her earlier, her knees tucked in, her gaze locked on the seat back in front of her. She looked like a child again, but inside, something was changing. She was not afraid anymore. The intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver. For your safety, we ask you to remain seated. Local authorities will board shortly, but this wasn't safety. It was a warning." At the front of the plane, Tyrek Vane adjusted his tie again and again, jaw tight, smile ready. His statement was prepared. His version of the story tidy, sanitized, corporate safe. The passenger became disruptive. We attempted de-escalation. We were concerned for the comfort of others. He'd practiced it 100 times, but his hands were shaking, because deep down, he knew the lie was about to meet the truth. The door opened with a heavy clang. Not police, not first. It was Clara Bennett, head of Horizon Fly's Crisis Operations Team. She wore a navy blazer, tight bun, and a neutral expression that screamed control. She stepped into the cabin, followed by 2 security officers, and, unexpectedly, a man in a gray overcoat and wireframe glasses. No one knew who he was, except Elias. The man gave Elias the smallest of nods, and Elias returned it, just barely. That was Luther Grant, his chief legal officer, and his presence on the tarmac told Elias something important. We're no longer responding to this incident. We're containing a corporate war. Clara stood near the cockpit and cleared her throat. At this time, we will be deplaning all passengers by row. You will notice security present at the front. This is a standard protocol, a lie. Everyone knew it, and phones were already recording from row 17, row 9, even a business traveler from row 3 holding his phone at chest level like he was just scrolling emails. Lena Hallbrook approached quietly and stood near Elias. "They're not sure what to do with you," she said softly. "Good," he replied. Then louder, he asked, "Are they letting the girl off first?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "We'll need to speak with her before she exits." Elias turned to Sariah. "You stay with me." Clara stiffened. "Sir, this is Horizon Fly policy, and I'm Horizon Fly's largest enterprise partner for next-gen Wi-Fi deployment." Elias interrupted. "Would you like to check the contract?" A sharp breath. Clara hesitated, because she knew what Elias was saying without saying it. "You want a PR nightmare? Try detaining a black teenager with no cause under the watch of a CEO with 5 tech journalists on speed dial." The rows began emptying, one by one, but no one rushed to get off, because everyone knew they were watching a story unfold in real time. A reckoning. When it came time for row 1, Elias and Sariah stood. Elias buttoned his coat. Sariah straightened her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked her. She nodded. "I don't want to cry." "You don't have to. You already did the hardest thing." "What's that? You stayed." As they approached the exit, Clara stepped aside. The man in the gray coat, Luther Grant, greeted Elias with a calm smile. "Statements ready," he said quietly. "Embargo lifts in 20 minutes. Make sure they know the girl's name." Elias said, "Not mine. Hers." Luther nodded. Sariah blinked up at him. "What statement?" Elias looked down at her. "The one that says you deserve to fly without being treated like a problem. The one that tells everyone what really happened. Will it help? It won't fix the world, but it'll make sure they don't forget your face." Outside the plane, cameras flashed. Airport security held the press back. Clara barked something into a walkie-talkie, but it didn't matter. The story had taken flight without her. And as Elias and Sariah stepped onto the jet bridge, the murmurs began. Passengers behind them, whispers growing bolder, one by one. "That was wrong. I saw the whole thing. He didn't do anything. They tried to cover it. She was just a kid. He protected her." And in that moment, for the first time in hours, Sariah smiled. The waiting area outside Gate C-24 was no longer just a terminal. It was a spotlight, a pressure chamber, the kind that turned silent moments into viral footage and quiet dignity into headlines. Elias Monroe walked beside Sariah Jameson, flanked by his legal chief Luther Grant and ally Lena Hallbrook, who had exited the plane minutes after them. No one spoke, not yet. but the energy in the air said everything. Phones were filming, staff were whispering. Security tried to contain it, but the scene had already spiraled past containment. A journalist from Flight Track News live-streamed the exit ramp. "This is breaking," she whispered. Sources say the man removed from his seat earlier was none other than Elias Monroe, chairman of SkyTide Tech. She turned the camera, and the teenage girl at the center of this story. Still unnamed, still unseen, but that's changing. Outside the terminal, the temperature had dropped. So had the calm. By the time Elias and Sariah reached the private car waiting curbside, the first press statement had dropped. A SkyTide issued memo, stamped with Elias's signature, circulated Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and major newswires within minutes. It read simply, "Earlier today, a young black passenger was subjected to unjust treatment on Flight 394. As a passenger and as a human being, I could not stay silent. What happened was not just procedural failure, it was personal bias, dressed in uniform. This is not an attack, it is an invitation to do better. Elias Monroe, Chairman, SkyTide Tech." The post was viewed 1.4 million times in its first 30 minutes. In the back seat of the car, Sariah sat quietly beside Elias. "That was your statement?" she asked. Elias nodded. "But you didn't say my name. I didn't need to. The world already is." He handed her his phone. She scrolled. There it was, a clip from TikTok. Her own face, her voice, shaken but strong. "I paid for my seat. Why are you asking me to move?" It had been viewed over 12 million times. The comments poured in. "That girl's a hero. She stood her ground. I'm crying. What airline was this? I'm done with them." The car rode in silence for a moment, until Sariah whispered, "I didn't want to be seen like this." Elias turned toward her, calm but direct. "You weren't seen wrong. You were seen right by people who've been ignored for too long." Sariah didn't answer right away. She was processing something bigger than embarrassment, bigger than fear. She was digesting the truth. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a mirror. And the world had finally looked. Back at Horizon Fly headquarters, panic had set in. Clara Bennett was on call after call. "It's already gone national. He's pulled funding on 3 of our tech upgrade contracts, and the board's demanding a response." She turned to her assistant, pale and shaking. "Get me Tyrick Vane, now." But Tyrick wasn't picking up. He was still in the Denver airport staff break room, watching his own face flash across multiple news outlets, all while his hands shook. He hadn't been fired yet, but he knew what was coming, and worse than that, he knew he deserved it. He hadn't hit anyone, he hadn't yelled, but he'd made a choice to dismiss, to devalue, to see a black teenager as disposable, and assume no one would care. In the passenger terminal, Lena Halbrook sat on a bench near baggage claim, speaking softly into her phone. "Yes, I'll give my account formally. I have notes, time-stamped, audio clips too." Pause. "No, I'm not doing it for fame. I'm doing it because silence is how these things stay normal." She ended the call and leaned back, exhausted. A ripple of courage had started on that plane, and she was part of it. Elsewhere, corporate phones rang. PR teams rewrote talking points. Stockholders whispered about image risk. But none of it could undo what had already taken hold. A new narrative was forming, and Elias Monroe was not backing down. In his downtown hotel suite, Elias finally allowed himself to sit still. He stared out at the Denver skyline, its quiet glass towers glinting in the early night. Luther poured him a glass of water and set it beside him. "Tomorrow's a media storm," Luther said. "3 networks want live interviews." Elias didn't answer immediately. He was staring at a message he hadn't opened until now, from a woman named Kemi Franklin. She'd once been removed from a plane for speaking Yoruba to her son. It had made the news for a day, and then nothing. But her message said this: "I saw the clip, the way you stood up, the way she didn't back down. I cried in my kitchen, because for the first time, I didn't feel crazy." Elias exhaled. This wasn't about him anymore. It never had been. Later that night, Elias knocked gently on the door to the room next to his. Sariah answered, hair still damp from a shower, eyes wide. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Me either," he said, "but that's okay." She sat on the floor. He sat beside her. No speeches, no strategy, just quiet. 2 people caught in the crosshairs of truth, sitting in the soft noise of its impact. And though the world outside buzzed with headlines and hashtags in that small silence, they simply breathed. The next morning, Denver's sky wore a steel-gray veil, low clouds, cold wind, and a storm building far louder than thunder. Elias Monroe stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the Sky-Tide suite, watching the airport runway in the distance. His suit jacket lay untouched on the bed. He wasn't dressing for business today. He was dressing for truth. Across the city, Horizon Fly's crisis team assembled in a conference room that had seen more contracts than consequences. Clara Bennett slammed her palm on the table. "We've lost 4 major corporate travel accounts overnight, and Monroe hasn't taken our call. He hasn't said a word publicly since his statement because he doesn't have to. The world is talking for him." She turned to the HR director. "Status on Tyrick Vane." "We've suspended him pending investigation." "Suspend?" Clara shot back. "You think suspension will quiet a national outcry? He becomes our scapegoat now, or we all go down." Tyrick Vane was already watching it unfold. He sat at home, lights off, TV glowing. His name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Commentators called him the face of corporate racism in America. Others simply called him forgettable. He buried his head in his hands, not out of denial, out of realization. "I wasn't just following policy," he muttered. "I was protecting power, mine. And that power was now bleeding from every corner of his life." By mid-morning, Elias, Sariah, Lena, and Luther met privately at a downtown legal center. Papers lined the polished table. But this wasn't litigation. This was an ultimatum. "We don't want silence money," Elias said. "We're not here to negotiate apologies or NDAs." He looked directly at the Horizon Fly liaison, one of the few who still had the nerve to show up in person. "We want institutional accountability. We want your internal videos made public. We want that gate audio released, and we want your DEI head to step down. Today," the liaison blinked. "If we comply, do we keep our contract with Sky-Tide? No." Elias said calmly, "That contract is already void. This isn't leverage. This is integrity." Back at the airport, passengers from Flight 394 began receiving texts, a digital survey, a question about the incident, follow-ups, photos. Horizon Fly was in damage control mode. Too late, because a second video emerged. This one showed Noel Rakeen, the gate agent, whispering with Tyrick minutes before the seating conflict. The audio was barely clear, but one sentence snapped through like a crack of lightning. "Yeah, the girl's in seat 2A. Her name's Sariah. Let's bump her quietly. She won't make a scene. They were wrong." She had made a scene not with rage, but with courage, and now that whisper had become a megaphone. Sariah Jameson hadn't said much all day. She sat beside Lena in a quiet coffee shop while news tickers rolled on nearby screens. "Why do they keep showing my face?" she whispered. "I didn't want to be famous." "You're not famous," Lena said gently. "You're unforgettable." Later that afternoon, Elias received a text from a number he hadn't seen in years. Malcolm Tran, a former colleague from a diversity task force he'd helped build. "You woke up something big." The message read, "The airline industry's in meltdown behind closed doors. Some are calling you a liability, others a necessary fire." Elias stared at the message. Quiet. He didn't care about being either. He just wanted to be human. That night, a special segment aired on NBC Nightly News. Sariah's story was no longer confined to TikTok. It had become a case study in bias, power, and resistance. Clips of the confrontation aired, then clips of Elias, helping her down the jetway. Then, a pause. A wide shot of the two of them walking through the Denver terminal side by side. The voiceover said they didn't set out to change policy, but sometimes change doesn't wait for permission. Meanwhile, inside the Horizon Fly boardroom, a vote was being cast. 7-2, Clara Bennett was removed as crisis director. The airline issued a statement the next morning. "We failed our passengers, we failed our values, and in doing so, we reminded the world why accountability still matters." For Elias, the real reckoning wasn't in boardrooms or contracts. It was quieter than that. It was watching Sariah walk into a scholarship interview a week later and seeing the fire in her voice when she spoke about standing firm when the world expects you to shrink. It was answering a handwritten letter from a boy in Tulsa who said, "You made me believe I'm worth standing up for." It was realizing that impact doesn't ask for attention. It simply leaves it everywhere. The reckoning had begun. But Elias wasn't done. Not yet. The departure board at Denver International flickered like a heartbeat. Gate C-22, Flight 902. Destination Atlanta. Sariah Jameson sat by the window, ticket in hand. She wasn't flying first class. She didn't need to. She belonged now not because of the seat, but because of the strength she had found in herself. Across the concourse, Elias Monroe stood watching. No press, no entourage, just a leather duffel and silence. The weeks that followed the scandal had stripped layers he never knew he wore. Fury, restraint, doubt, but now, clarity. He wasn't here as a CEO. He was here as a witness to a new beginning. Lena Hallbrook approached from behind, still in uniform. "You're not flying out." Elias shook his head gently. "No, I'm staying for a board meeting with the Civil Aviation Oversight Council. They're finally ready to listen." Lena smiled faintly. "They're not just listening. Elias, they're rebuilding because of you." On national news, headlines had shifted from outrage to reform. Horizon Fly announced a complete revamp of their internal policies. AI-assisted seat monitoring for bias, anonymous incident reporting, a new DEI council led not by executives but by employees of color, and Tyrick Vane. He publicly resigned, released a statement, and disappeared from the spotlight. But closure didn't mean erasure. It meant remembrance and responsibility. Sariah pulled out a note from her backpack, creased, folded, carefully preserved. It was from Elias, written the day after the fallout. Dear Sariah, they tried to shrink you, but you stood taller. They tried to silence you, but your silence roared. And when the world watched, you didn't just survive. You reminded us what dignity looks like on fire. She smiled softly, tears welling. I'm not who I was before that flight, she whispered. I'm more now. Across the country, ripple effects followed. One airline CEO stepped down. Another hired a diversity review board. Senators introduced legislation for airline conduct transparency. This wasn't just a moment. It had become a movement. Later that afternoon, Elias attended the closed-door council meeting. 13 members, 2 journalists, 1 purpose. He sat quietly until the chairman called on him. Mr. Monroe, you've been at the center of an unfortunate. Elias raised a hand, calmly interrupting. Let's not call it unfortunate. That's polite language for systems designed to protect only some. Then what would you call it? Someone asked. A fracture, he said, and fractures expose the bones beneath. Silence filled the room. He leaned in. If we don't rebuild this skeleton with equity, every passenger becomes a gamble, and sooner or later, someone dies not just from accidents, but from being erased in plain sight. A pause, then nods, then notes, then change. Later that evening, Elias returned to the terminal. Flight 912 was gone, but something else remained. A girl's voice, a quiet defiance, a legacy. He stood at the window, alone, watching a sunset melt into the horizon, and finally he allowed himself to exhale. Not because the battle was over, but because truth had finally taken flight. Some stories end in applause. This one ends in reflection. Elias Monroe never raised his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't demand. But his silence spoke louder than any outburst. Because behind that silence was history, pain, strength, and purpose. This wasn't just a story about a powerful black man being disrespected. It was about how everyday prejudice still thrives in places we think are neutral. It was about a teenage girl who reminded us that courage doesn't need a microphone. It was about a pilot who chose dignity over protocol. It was about an industry forced to look at itself and finally break the mirror. And maybe it's about all of us. Because discrimination doesn't knock, it just shows up, quietly, until someone like Elias says, not anymore. So, if this story moved you, if it made you think twice about silence, about bias, about belonging, like this video, share it, and hit that subscribe button because the next story might be your own. And we'll be right here, ready to tell it.